All right, welcome everyone. We've got people joining us right now, so we just want to say welcome. We're going to get started. You hopefully are in the right place. This is the informational webinar on tracking technological trends in education, community co-research project and survey. And this is the Data for Public Good campaign. And I am here with Dr. Catherine Squires as well. So greetings to everyone. We are going to get started. We value your time. Just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded and we will be sharing it out as well. If you will please turn to the next slide. So you are in very capable hands. My name is Marika Pfefferkorn. I am with the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance and the Midwest Center for School Transformation, and I'm also a member of the Dignity in Schools campaign. And I'm here with Dr. Squires. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself, Dr. Squires?
Hi, Catherine Squires. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota, and I've been collaborating with Marika and others around issues of school pushout and now also data for public good. Really happy to be working with you all.
Thank you so much. If you will, the next slide, please. So we are here with a purpose today. This webinar is really about inviting you, engaging you as community members to become co-researchers and to do some information gathering for us, data gathering, if you will, on emerging technological trends that are emerging across the country. That is big data, predictive analytics, algorithms, threat assessments, joint powers agreements, and many more things that we are finding that are surfacing all around the country. So we're looking to achieve and gain commitments from you as participants of this webinar to represent your local community and do a search, an information gathering search in your community so that we can have representation from all across the country. So that's the goal for this webinar, is to kind of outline how we're going to go about doing that. But I also want to share with you the bigger goal, and that is with the Data for Public Good campaign is really about capturing all of this information from across the country and then translating that into data that will populate a heat map that Dr. Squires is going to be working with us on designing. And that heat map will share with us what types of trends are emerging, who are the vendors that are involved in the local communities, as well as what policies potentially are or are not in place in order to support protecting student data privacy as well as family data privacy. So this is a multi-tiered project, and this is a beginning step, and we're really glad that you're interested in being a part of this process. And the next slide, if you will. So I want to give you a little history and context so that it's not just, we're just randomly asking you to go out and capture some information. Some of you may have heard about a joint powers agreement that came into being in the Twin Cities, and specifically Ramsey County and the city of St. Paul and St. Paul Public Schools. These three entities came into an agreement. They created a joint powers agreement and then created a joint powers board in an effort to share information more readily with each other. So when I say the city of St. Paul and I mention Ramsey County, these are really large government bodies that have multiple departments, which means that they have multiple groups and divisions that are collecting and hold different kinds of data. So some of the departments we found were critical in our exploration around who was getting the information is simply with the county system. You might have probation, you might have the county prosecutor's office, you have human services, public health, child protection. And these are all departments that hold really critical private information. And in the Twin Cities, these three entities all unanimously approved to enter into a joint powers agreement. So this joint powers agreement was a large-scale cross-system data sharing. So that's the big data piece. And then they entered into a joint powers agreement, and they have a board. And this agreement included the application and integration of predictive analytics and the use of algorithms. And so I don't want folks to shut down immediately because I'm talking about technological terms. We'll talk more about those later and we'll give you resources to talk about them. But what you need to know in our community is that these terms showed up in communications around this agreement, and immediately there are just some red flags that came up for us. So what I want you to understand as this history and context is that these government entities, the school district, the county, and the city, their intention was good. The purpose was well intended. This agreement was meant to improve service effectiveness, and it's meant to increase efficiencies by using artificial intelligence or machine learning to identify children that are suspected of being at risk of future criminal behavior. And we'll get into our challenge with the using artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify children for anything. But first, we'll start with the next slide, please. So what I want you to also understand is that the joint powers agreement that emerged in the Twin Cities, although it appeared to come out of nowhere, it was years in the making. And so I'm just sharing with you this story and this kind of timeline to understand that it was 5 years in the making, and there were bits of information that were public, but we really did not have the full picture. And that's why it's important for communities to understand where these things might be showing up in your local community. So first on this, and these are all timelines that were pulled together based on public meetings. So we were able to track and document how this information emerged. And so you'll see that in early 2014 that they're searching for information, or I'm sorry, funding from a local foundation. So they're submitting a grant. And what's important about that grant is that in that grant, they were requesting resources for community engagement. They also indicated that they wanted to have conversations around predictive analytics. And so that language was in the grant, although that was not publicly advertised as a purpose or meaning for folks to gather to have conversation. So what you see is that you have this grant that emerges and supports community engagement around what would improve the ability of systems and communities to work together to produce better outcomes for youth. So they got this grant, they hosted over the course of a couple years community engagement sessions, formally and informally. There was the county prosecutor's office had a task force, and then they also had a local community engagement group called Marnita's Table that hosted a number of sessions across the city to talk about what it is that they would like to see. So again, there's this public conversation that happens, people participate in it, there's a report that is published and shared, and then things kind of go quiet and dark. And that's where you see that third sector capital becomes a player in this conversation. And they are proposing to support an initiative such as a data sharing agreement by providing a loan or large amounts of resources, because they believe that by using a data sharing agreement will make things more effective and efficient, and therefore the district will save money and be able to pay back this loan. So that's another point of intersection that's important to take note of in community, is who's popping up to show support for these joint powers agreements or memorandums of understanding, because they don't just come out of nowhere and they're not free. So next you'll see that our county prosecutor's office is approached by a vendor, the National Council of Crime and Delinquency, and they proposed to our county that they would pilot a joint powers agreement data sharing body where they would provide predictive analytics and the algorithms to provide a risk score, an early warning system for these entities in order to address the needs of our system. So already you're seeing two types of vendors that have shown up in this journey around getting a joint powers agreement in place. Following that, there's a year where, again, there isn't much communication with the community, but this is what we call the legal rounds, where the lawyers of each of these entities go into their departments and say, what would it take in order for us to be able to share this data? What are the issues with the systems? What are the concerns you have about privacy? And they worked and fleshed through all this information to construct or come up with an agreement that then would be viable for all three entities, the city, the county, and the district, to share this information and it to be stored in one single place on a platform. And so then you see that there's a joint powers agreement approval. And what you'll need to note is there were public presentations early on about this at all of the public entities. But when it came to the joint powers agreement, what happened was it was slipped or put into a consent agenda. So it wasn't a publicly discussed approval of the joint powers agreement. It was done by consent as a large agenda that had a number of items that they did not go into at the meeting itself. And so then we find that all of these things have come into play over the course of 5 years, and that the Twin Cities is community, parents and youth and community members are really concerned about the outcome. If you will, please forward to the next slide. So I wanted to give folks an opportunity to see how to find these documents, what they might look like, and what you might be looking for in them. So what you see before you in this slide is the actual joint powers agreement that was written in St. Paul. And one of the things you'll note in community conversations and in public presentations, it was inconsistently discussed whether predictive analytics was a part of this agreement, but we want to highlight some of the language that you might be looking for in your own community. So you see in this joint powers agreement, it is directly outlined that predictive analytics will be used. But you'll also see that they're using that as a tool to reduce juvenile justice involvement. In the second paragraph down, line 12 in that paragraph, further down, you'll see an alert system to target appropriate interventions. And that's what we call an early warning alarm system, is often used as a title to describe that they would have these indicators in place, these warning systems in place to flag children. Then I also want you to notice what else came up for us as a concern that might show up in some of your local community documents, is that it's very open-ended about how the information will be shared and with who. So you'll see that it suggests here that under appropriate circumstances, information from the districts that would not otherwise be available to the partners would be shared. So that's some problematic information that we flagged, because again, we need to have a clear sense of, if you're going to be sharing this data, who gets to see it, who gets to use it, and how will it be used. So these were some red flags for us and how this was set up as well. And what we also have in the state of Minnesota is that community members are structurally excluded from joint powers agreements and joint powers boards. So there also was a flag for us for our inability to see the decision making that would happen at this joint powers agreement level or the joint powers entity level. If you will, shift to the next slide. So why were we concerned when we started hearing terms like predictive analytics and risk scores? Well, for us in Minnesota, it was simply because what they were talking about as forms of indicators or measures would be flawed. And so they were talking about using as indicators for the city. Well, what if some of their family members, a sibling, had been arrested? That might be a check against a student, or if their family members had interaction with the police. It didn't even have to be them. It could have been a family member. With the county, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different types of services that are provided, whether it's receiving child protection involvement, juvenile detention involvement, welfare enrollment, adult incarceration. This is all the data that would potentially be shared with, when you have the city of St. Paul, it's the police department and it's law enforcement also. And then the data that would be shared with the district, which was particularly troubling with us if you're going to use it as a way to assess risk for a student, was suspension data, because we know in Minnesota that our suspension data that we have is pretty flawed, and it leans towards discrimination in out-of-school suspensions for students of color, and particularly Black students. So if you're putting flawed information into the system to inform effectiveness and efficiencies, that does not lead to the outcome we are seeking. They were also talking about using attendance data, which can also be very subjective depending on who's looking at it and interpreting it, and whether it's accurately and correctly kept. Your special education status, your free to reduce status, lunch status, these are all pieces of data that could potentially have impact on how your child or your family is perceived in the system, and that a risk score could potentially be assigned to your child. If you will, the next slide. So I just want to let you know that from our experience, that going through this joint powers agreement and the information that I've shared, we want to raise particular risks when it comes to joint powers agreements, threat assessments, risk assessments, predictive analytics. All of these things come up with reasons why we are really trying to make communities aware of these things that are happening and emerging behind the scenes. So we see this predictive analytics as racially profiling children as future criminals, because again, they haven't been able to articulate, once they have collected this data, once they have assigned a risk score, what would they be able to provide that would change or shift what's happening in the young person's life. And other than collecting this information, we have not seen a demonstration how it would be used for good. And so we believe that really this is about racially profiling children as future criminals. Also saying assigning a risk assessment is really about stigmatizing children and families, and thinking about how adults and community members, staff, and professionals will be interacting with these young people, if the lens that they're looking at them through is one of a deficit of, you have a risk score, you have suspensions, you have really bad attendance, and therefore you're at risk for being a part of the juvenile justice system, is really stigmatizing. And also, again, in our conversations, is that a lot of resource is being pushed towards these emerging technological trends. There's a lot of resource that is being invested specifically into these data sharing platforms, and yet that money is going towards the technology and not actually to the system supports of programming and the practices that we actually know with young people. So this is a really expensive approach, and we believe it's actually just diverting resources from human-centered responses that we would like to put in play, that community members have been suggesting for a long time, but haven't really gotten the traction that we would like to see. And then finally, we really believe this is about ignoring system responsibility for correcting disparities. And so oftentimes these data, joint powers, data sharing agreements, the way that they're looking at the data is really about looking at the child as the issue, rather than the systems that continue to perpetuate those disparities. And that's why we want our community members across the country to be aware of something like this already exists. If it's in the making, it's emerging, or it's even in conversation. We want to know about it to make sure that communities have the opportunity to be at the front and center of making decisions around it. If you will, turn to the next slide. So again, this is really about lessons learned at our local level in St. Paul, but taking this conversation to a national level, because just in a cursory glance, looking up on the internet, I've found that these kind of conversations are happening all over the country. And so some of them that you might actually see are that the On Guard system has been promoting their complete school safety solution as a response to mass shootings in schools. And so in that particular suite of tools that they're selling to districts, they have social media monitoring that is provided by intelligence or former intelligence officials. It also uses criminalizing infrastructure like cameras and other pieces. These are all data points that folks are collecting about our children and that will need to be stored somewhere. I also share on the screen a letter about a problematic data sharing agreement that occurred somewhere else and had to be shut down because they did not really go through a rigorous conversation about what is acceptable. And so we have seen a couple of examples of how these data conversations are percolating up. They get a lot of investment and support, and because they're not integrating this conversation with the community, they're advancing them without them being fully vetted. And so we really want to prevent that and make sure that the communities are involved in the ground level if it is going to happen. Another example of this happening is in Kansas City Public Schools. And they have a citywide data partnership that's offering new ways to serve students. And that's just something I picked up off the internet. And these, again, are percolating up all over the country, so much so that we can't keep track of all of them, and we need your help. Next slide, please. So again, this is around data for public good and a campaign that we are launching to really identify where these emerging technological trends in education are happening. They're happening in rural communities, they're happening in suburban communities, and they're happening in urban communities. And we need everybody to be aware of them. And our approach is really about foundationally going from research to engagement to policy. Next slide, please. So what we're doing right now is we're tapping into individuals and organizations and networks to do this initial landscape analysis to see where it's emerging. So we're asking you and other participants to gather data and complete a research survey that Dr. Squires will share with you in a bit on existing and emerging trends. We are looking to support a small stipend for you to participate in this data gathering. So what we will need folks to do is actually sign up formally so we can communicate those details to you. I want to also note that we are doing webinars, we have a worksheet, we're creating a data primer prototype, all in an effort to support you in your work on the ground. Next slide, please. Once we've actually collected all this data from you, what we'd like to do is do some focus groups and also eventually bring folks together in a room to talk about what we've learned, what we've unpacked, what we've surfaced, and what we want to do about it. And at minimum, I think that we can come up with some clear recommendations and guidelines for communities to follow as these emerging technological trends continue to emerge everywhere across the country. So in addition to this heat map, what our hope is, even if you don't find anything in your community, that may be a really good thing, but what that does is provides us with an opportunity to get in front of this. So even if you go through the survey and you don't find the information that you think would be a red flag for you, that's okay. What the next stage after we do this research and the data collection is providing some guidance and recommendations. And what that will also include is what types of policies need to be in place in order to prevent what happened in St. Paul from happening anywhere else. And so you still are a critical part of this conversation. And then finally, once we get all folks together on the same page, we want to activate communities and making sure that there's nobody that's left out of this conversation. So what we want to offer is opportunities for folks on the ground to host and advocate for themselves. And that means that we need to also provide you with the tools to do so. So that might mean some train the trainer, that means coming and providing data academies in your communities or preparing you to do the same, because we're really at the foundational level of what needs to happen in order to get a hold of this emerging technological trend. So this is really about equipping you and equipping folks within your community to be proactive rather than reactive after you found out something's already in play. Next slide, if you will. So phase 3 is advocate and advance at the local and national level. There is no privacy without the expectation of privacy, and that is what we have surfaced and found in our conversations here locally. So we need to tell people what our expectation is about privacy. So we're going to be looking for folks to contribute to the recommendations and the guidelines, but we're also going to need you to share your story with other folks. And then we're also working to build a tool so we can track the emergence of this technological trend through um, a collaborative policy tracking tool. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Catherine Squires, and she's going to walk you through, okay, so you've got the history and the context, you know why you're doing this, and then it's the next step of committing to take on this, participating in this survey. We're going to walk through the worksheet, the survey, and the additional supports. So next slide, please, and Dr. Squires, please take it away.
Hello, thanks again for joining us today, and for those of you who join us through a recording in the future, thanks for taking the time to be part of this work. It's really important. I just want to reiterate some of the things that Marika said, that as state governments, school districts, the police departments, and also commercial entities start to work together to use data, information about your family, your students, their experiences, and harvest that data, store it somewhere, and then remix it to predict things or to sometimes sell things. We really don't have a good idea, and most of our local, state, and national governments don't have any policies in place to make sure that people don't get hurt. So this is a really important study, and we hope that you join us on it. So this slide here gives you a glimpse of the pre-survey worksheet that we'll share with you once you sign up. What we wanted to do was recognize that if you're looking for information, you might have to go to different places to find it, particularly in a situation like this where transparency is an issue. So as Marika's history showed you, there were times when, as the school districts and the health department and the county prosecutor were talking about how could they use big data to, help identify students in need or families in need, they didn't talk to the community at every point. They did not advertise or make announcements about public meetings for every stage. And so we recognize that you might do some searching online. You might go to the State Department of Education, your local school district's website, but you might not find anything there. You might have to go to a school board meeting and ask a question during open session. You might go to a town hall meeting with a local representative and ask them if they know if there's any data sharing agreements in the mix as things are happening either at the state legislature or in the city council or wherever it might be, or the school board. So this worksheet is something that you'll be able to just download and print out, and then as you're searching or talking to folks or reading the newspaper, you'll be able to start answering the questions, circling the information that you see, and then have that on hand when we send you the survey link. So this worksheet is just a way to help you guide your exploration as you're searching for information about data sharing agreements, joint powers agreements, any kind of agreement that's in process or already online between schools and other government entities that may or may not be transparent to the public. So next slide, please. So this is just an example of what the survey looks like. So once you sign up to be part of our research team, you will get the worksheet. And then in about a week after you receive the worksheet, when you've had some time to perhaps get some answers or perhaps find out, as Marika said, that nothing's happening yet, which is all to the good because that means we can get ahead of it, you'll get sent this survey link, which will come in your email. And when you click on the link, this will be the first page that you see, thanking you for being part of Data for Public Good. Next slide, please. And then you'll just see questions that really match up with the worksheet you've already filled out. So we wanted to ask some questions about how familiar people were with the issue of data sharing and JPAs and MOUs, but Also where you might be hearing about it in your community from the news media, maybe from the places you go online or social media, or maybe not at all. So in terms of that heat map, we're trying to get a sense of how much data sharing involved with schools is part of the conversation in your area. So we'll be asking you questions about what you might have found, but also what you might be hearing from other sources. Next slide, please. And again, the bulk of the survey is to find out whether or not you have found that there is, there will be, or perhaps was, because maybe there was a joint data sharing agreement and it got nixed, like the one in Los Angeles or the one here in St. Paul, because communities rose up and said, not on our watch, right? So we'll be asking you questions about if there is one, or if there's one in the works, if it's in process, or if it's already in place. And then what have you found out about that agreement that you can tell from the public resources you're able to tap into, either online or in person, or perhaps your local newspaper. Maybe someone does a radio interview and you're listening to that and you hear about it, and you can collect some data that way. Next slide.
So it's back to me. And we wanted to just give you some ideas. In the worksheet that Dr. Squires spoke about, there's some words at the end that you could use for a online search. But we just wanted to highlight them as part of this conversation in the webinar so you can see and start thinking about, where might I start looking? And so the terms that we really have found in our searches beyond just St. Paul, the language that is often used is risk assessment, threat assessment, early intervention warning systems for schools, predictive analytics, integrated data to educate the whole student. The whole student is one of the terms that they're using for this data sharing across entities. Integrated data sharing platform, interoperability, which means that the systems have to be able to talk to each other in order for it to be an effective data collection and analysis. Data trusts and collaboratives. So many folks are finding that it's very expensive to host and hold data and to protect it and ensure that it's secure. And so they're building data trusts, and that name is actually transitioning to data collaboratives. But this is where you might find that people do the data mining to find the information about your students, about your families, or where they might be housing it. It used to be called a data warehouse. And then finally, we want you to also think about what types of agreements might be named in this process. So you have the joint powers agreement, you have the memorandum of understanding. So those are the terms they use specifically in our community. But if you have come up already and know of some other terms, we really would appreciate you to enter them into the chat box so you can share them with us and the others that will be viewing this webinar and that are currently on this webinar. Next slide, please. So again, this is all about how you can best access the information and how you know your community. So what you see here on this slide is you can go into Google for a search, but it may be just as beneficial to have the conversations with people who you already have relationship with or need to build relationship with. So ask a school board member about that data sharing. Dr. Squires mentioned that. Ask the superintendent, a county administrator. And the county administrator or board member may not know. It might be their staff person, because what I will say that we found in St. Paul is that most of our folks were not actually able to talk about what it was that they had signed on to. So even if you come up against an individual that doesn't seem or appear to understand what you're talking about, does not mean it doesn't exist. This is still new language, new terms, and people still are becoming more comfortable and familiar with it. So you might go to a district or a county's legal department. You might go to your city council person or their mayor, and again, check out the staff person. The law enforcement, the county prosecutor's office, And again, if any of you have suggestions of where you might start to have this conversation in a local place, please enter it into the chat box because it would be helpful for all of us. Next slide, please. So here are a few other helpful tips that we found when we went back to look at the information. We wish we had almost started there. But so just even in this past year, start with your district's back to school packet. It may be digital, it may be hard copy, but you had to sign off on it. And that might give you a sense of what you've already approved or signed off on. So that could be your social media policy. It could mean your iPad if one of your students or a person is leasing the iPad for its use. That might give you a sense of any type of data that might be collected. That signature would be needed in that back to school packet. So it might be great to go back and look through those terms and conditions to see what you signed off on. And when you do, look at it to unpack what data might be shared because of this approval. Who might it be shared with? Why is it being shared? If it's not clear, then you also want to go to that list of asks we had on the previous slide. That would be a good place to start. How is it shared? Is it a platform? Is it an interoperable system? Where is it stored? And then when is it shared? So any of these questions about the data in that back to school packet might be a trigger or a piece of the puzzle to find out if something like this exists, because there have to be presently policies around data. It just may not be a policy around sharing data across systems. Next slide, please. So again, we are here to help you in this process. We did a lot of this front end work trying to figure out how to find our path when we went through this personally. So what we have done is, again, create some tools to make this as painless as possible so that you can do this information gathering. So you also find in the handouts portion of this webinar that we've provided the worksheet for you to look at, and we've also uploaded a data primer for you to download. So if you are encountering some of these words and you think it might mean something, but you're not sure and you don't want to go searching all around the internet, we've tried to condense some information, a glossary and some terms that you can use to help you in this search. So let's go to the next slide, Pete, please. Next steps, because as we have this conversation, we are at a crossroads where we have the opportunity to really capture this before it has consumed our systems and impacted our students and our families. So what we are asking for each of you to do is to sign up in the chat or send us an email to say, yes, I will be that co-researcher in my community. And our goal is to have at least 25 sites sign up to do this. And literally more than one person can sign up for an individual community, because your search will not be identical to the one that anyone else does, because it's through your lens and your experience. So multiple sites in one community are okay, because we want to collect as much information. We're also going to ask that if you have relationship with people that are not in your local community across the country, we ask that you engage them as well to do this information gathering, because this is not going to happen with any of these large organizations or other spaces. If we want to be able to communicate this message about what's happening, it's going to have to happen in a grassroots way for us to be able to tell the full story. So that's why we're relying so heavily on our individual community members who can really represent communities across the country. We ask you to stay engaged, because as you saw, hopefully in the webinar earlier, that this is not just about data gathering. It's about what are the next steps and what are we going to do with that data once it's gathered. So we want you to be a part of this team as we move forward. And so you can help gather the data and also help inform other people about what they need to be paying attention to and focusing on in their community, and providing recommendations and guidelines. So again, nobody else has to experience what we did or risk what we almost risked. And then finally, we're going to be looking for individual communities that might be willing to tell their story about what they found or didn't find. We're going to be partnering on a national level. And so we want communities to be able to speak for their own space. And so if you would be willing to tell your story about what was it like to look for and try to find this information, and what was the reaction, and what are you going to do about it now that you found it? We want to absolutely capture this, because this is a story that needs to be shared and told again and again. Next slide, please. Also, just want to let you know that if you are not webinared out already, we have another webinar where we'll do a deeper dive around this data, big data, predictive analytics and algorithms. It's called No Data About Us Without Us. And so that's tomorrow, and I'll be sharing that webinar with Dr. Roxana Marashi. I apologize. So we will be hosting that webinar. The Dignity in Schools campaign and the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance will be hosting that webinar tomorrow. So we'll hope you will join us then. Next slide, please. At this time, what we'd like to do is open it up for any questions folks might have that are on this webinar. We are happy to have questions answered offline, but you can either enter any questions, comments, thoughts in the chat box, or our fearless tech provider, Tafari, will also be able to share them out as well. So while we're waiting for any questions, what you'll see on the screen now is an email address for you to follow up and sign up, admin@tciamn.org. You can ask questions about the project, and email Professor Squires. Professor Squires, will you please put your email address in the chat box if people need to access you? So Dr. Squires will be working with folks if you have any questions about the worksheet, if you experience any barriers with the survey itself. She is your go-to. And then also, after this, again, I mentioned that this recording or this webinar is being recorded, and that we will be sharing it out with people. So you can also use this webinar as a tool, but we also suggest that you forward it to your friends, families, colleagues, networks, and others, so that we can really come at this from a comprehensive and a holistic approach across the country. Okay, it looks like that we don't have any current questions right now. So what I want to do is just say thank you, Dr. Squires, for your participation in this project. And thank you to all who have tuned in for this webinar. We really would like to engage you further in this project. So please do not hesitate to ask questions, and please do not hesitate to sign up and commit. This is not an enormous commitment, but it will require that you do some behind the scenes work before you complete the survey, but nothing to be intimidated about, and nothing that we are not willing to support you with completely.
Indeed, and we will send out 2 rounds of the survey. So if you get a lot of nothing, nothing, nothing in your first few days of looking, we'll send a follow-up to see if you've been able to discover anything else afterwards. So be on the lookout for 2 invitations to complete the survey. If you exhaust all of your options in searching the first time around, you can ignore the second invitation. But if you do come across new information between those 2 invitations, you'll be able to add back in additional information that you found.
Thank you very much, and have a great Monday.